Welcome to another episode of the Take What You Need podcast. I'm excited to have you guys back and listening with me. So yeah, let's get into this week's episode. It's something that I've talked about a couple of times on my Instagram stories. And it's something that I think a lot of us are curious about, but it sounds really ridiculous and stereotypical. It's masculine and feminine energy. It's become such a hot topic, and I think that's sometimes what puts people off it. It's become such a big talking point among the other broader gender conversations happening and everything we're pursuing around equality between the sexes, or equity, let's say, between the sexes, and also just thinking about what gender really means. But in and amongst all that conversation, there's this whole thing going on about masculine and feminine energy, and that feels a little bit stereotypical, a little bit more bubblegum than some of the other important things that we are thinking about and talking about right now in society. And by bubblegum, I mean you see people on social media advising you, specifically women, typically telling them to embrace your feminine energy by changing your appearance or making your appearance look a certain way so that it appeals to a certain aesthetic, or maybe feigning neediness or helplessness and making men be men. And as you can imagine it, a lot of the aesthetic around that is filled with pink and pigtails and frilly outfits and just other different stereotypes. Again, nothing wrong with the aesthetic, but it's just a certain category and certain depiction of femininity and womanhood. So you're doing all these things to try and get princess treatment or the items that you deserve, and it really feels like the conversation begins and ends there. There's little to no discussion about men or even women embracing their masculine energy, or whether that vision of femininity and feminine energy that's communicated is the only type, and if there are other ways that we can benefit ourselves. And I just find that really interesting, and I think that's part of the problem. That's where most of us switch off. Those of us who are old enough to have lived through multiple trends and eras, we feel like we're kind of moving backwards if we yield to this picture of feminine energy that's being put out there. And also anyone with a sense of individuality is questioning why they even have to adhere to this one conception of femininity to be a real woman. It just doesn't really add up, and it feels really strange. And that's because, in my view, while there's some truth in the current pop understanding of this whole feminine energy vibe, there's so much missing from it. That's why it feels a bit nonsensical. That's why it feels unbalanced, because it's incomplete. And for me, the truth is that we have both of these energies within us. And it's less about trying to be more feminine or more masculine, or less feminine and less masculine, and more about one, being able to understand where your energy typically leans towards as a default, and two, being able to leverage and shift those energies to your advantage. So today we're really going to explore and uncover what this concept of masculine versus feminine energy really is and what it really looks like. Spoiler alert, it's a lot simpler and more familiar than everyone's making it out to be, and how to use this understanding to help you navigate the different scenarios that you might find yourself in life. Quick disclaimer from me before I continue. I'm still learning. This is what I've discovered so far and what I think is helpful and working for me. It's a foundational understanding. I'm not an expert, and I would love to hear what your perspectives are as well. So where did this even come from for me? So I first became curious about the obsession with these two energies, as people would tout them as the reason why you're not getting XYZ in this area, the reason you're unsatisfied with a particular thing. And I always wondered, is something misaligned here? Am I not making progress in this area because I'm not embracing someone else's definition of femininity? It just didn't feel quite right. And that's where I was able to identify the first myth about this whole concept of energies, that it's not about gender norms. It's not about wearing a certain uniform or behaving a certain way that's prescribed by what's trending. It's actually a lot more subtle than that. And it's all about being free to be yourself in all of its diversity and knowing how to maneuver the different situations that life brings you. So before you can even use those energies, it's kind of important for us to even understand what they are. I know some people may be raising an eyebrow right now that I'm about to get into something really mystical. And while I do think that energy does have an element of mystery, it's also super practical. So let's just dive into some definitions, right? So number one, energy in its first description in Google was described as the strength and vitality required to sustain a physical and mental activity. And from a scientific point, we all know that all of the world is made up of energy, particles, atoms, etc. And quite simply, our energy is the strength or the vitality that we need to execute on something. I'd add in that it's not just physical or mental, it's all the activities in life, spiritual, emotional, etc., etc. Now, moving on to the definition of masculine and feminine energy and what that even means. From everything that I've observed so far, this categorization of masculine and feminine seems to have originated from an ancient beliefs in East Asia, better known as yin and yang. The yin, which is the feminine, represents things like fluidity, being able to receive, openness, devotion, creativity, community, intuition, and so much more. And the yang, the masculine, is reflective of leadership, action, reason, strength, firmness, power, and efficiency. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical sides of the belief systems that drive that, but just bear with me, stick with me, and just understand the principles and what these things all represent, right? So let's not forget that everyone has both energies moving throughout them. When I listed the yang, masculine qualities, there was leadership, there was action, there was reason, there was strength, there was power, there was efficiency. If you're a woman listening to that, you will know that you resonate with some of those qualities, right? And same on the yin, on the feminine, fluidity, openness, creativity, community, and intuition. You probably resonate with those too. So it's not about gender. And I think that's the biggest blocker and the biggest misconception, the biggest stumbling block that we tend to face when we talk about this topic. So understanding this simple distinction just starts to help you navigate which energy to dial up and dial down in specific situations. And I think that's where we get stuck in defining them in a gendered way, which just makes it super politicized, lots of questions, very you are a this, so you should be like this. And that's not what life is about. We shouldn't be policing or commodifying expressions of femininity or masculinity, especially when they're based on culture, which changes, when they're based on trends, which change, even though they feel like they're the end all be all at a given point in time. So, if you want to, embrace girliness if you like, etc., but that's not what this whole conversation, in my view, is really about. And this idea of two forces at work within us is also reflected in the concept of spirit versus the body or the flesh. In the Bible, the spirit is eternal, God is in us, and it's spiritual. The flesh, on the other hand, / the body, is a physical and temporary manifestation, useful and important, but kept in check by the spirit. And again, like I said, temporary versus eternal. So Galatians 5 verses 16 to 18 say, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit is what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you will not be under the law." I'm not saying that masculine versus feminine energy is directly the same as spirit and body, or spirit versus flesh, but this concept of duality and this delicate balance is definitely scriptural. The principles there are scriptural. There are parallels between the two concepts that help me to understand them a bit better, and I'll get into how it works practically in some examples in my life. But before I do, I think that the discussion has become so fixated on creating gendered categories and gendered names of these concepts that we've started to focus on that way too much, when actually it's about being able to experience or navigate how you balance those forces within you and how you keep them in check. And it's super important to know which side of the spectrum that you're more likely to default to, and then also figure out which side to use in the different scenarios that life may require from us. So let's apply some practical examples, right? Let's think about it in a real life context. This is how I personally leverage them in different scenarios in my life. And disclaimer, these are really personal to me, so don't copy them off the bat, but use them as a guide, potentially, as a map to help you in your own journey. So when it comes to getting things done in the workplace, where you need to step up, where you need to be bold, where you need to own your strengths, I've personally decided that I don't need to tone down my masculine energy at work. Remember, masculine is not gender. It's about, logic, forcefulness, dominance, etc. This has been a recent choice for me, to be honest, because I now recognize that my default in general is to be a little bit more dominant, a little bit more authoritative. I'm the oldest of siblings, etc. I've always known it's part of my personality. And despite being taught by society that maybe being agreeable and not rocking the boat and staying quiet is the best way to be, potentially also for a woman, I've decided to actually just step into what makes more sense for me on a personal level in terms of my personality, my defaults that I lean towards, but also what situation requires that. Like I said, when it's time to get things done in the workplace, when I need to step up, when I need to be bold and own my strengths, that's where that masculine energy can really thrive and really shine. By not doing that previously, I learned that I was actually doing myself a disservice. One, because I was showing up inauthentically and holding myself back, which really shows to other people. When you're holding yourself back, when you're inauthentic, people can feel that energy, even if they don't visually acknowledge it and you think you've gotten away with it. And two, and more importantly, I believe that the situations that God has put me in sometimes call for that masculine energy. Otherwise, I wouldn't be there, right? That's probably why I've been created with this particular personality and why I'm in these particular scenarios as well. And that way I can be myself and I can really shine. Now, that's not me saying that that's what it should be all the time, or that's what the world of work calls for. Actually, by contrast, when it comes to building and developing my business, whether it's onboarding new brands or signing new talent, the feminine, quote unquote, is what has really worked for me. It's really, really worked. One of the benefits of embracing the feminine in this area of originating and growing a business is because it helps me to affirm the fact that I actually trust God as a number one and not my own efforts and willpower. They help and they are definitely tools to be used, but they are not the foundation. They are not the essential part. So when it comes to building and taking on new people and agreeing to work with certain people, for me, nothing is forced. It doesn't mean that I'm not proactive. It doesn't mean I don't follow up, but I just try not to force situations or sell myself short for an opportunity. Primarily because I know how much energy is going to be needed to be exerted down the line in this partnership. You know, marketing is really intense, talent management is really full on, etc., etc. And I'm willing to cut my losses earlier rather than partner with someone because I feel like I should do it and then pay the cost of a bad partnership later on. I'd rather just align with someone who's completely on the same page as me. I know the value that I bring to that relationship, and I'm not running around trying to use my energy to prove it to anyone. Those that get it will get it, and I'm yet to be proven wrong. That is quite a contrary strategy to what people tell you should be doing, especially in a world that has been dominated by men and very strong, far masculine energy, very extreme masculine energy. That world and that culture says, do it by any means necessary, take every opportunity, take no prisoners, agree to everything you can because the more you get, the better it is, etc., etc. I can count so many, interviews and conversations I've watched with entertainment moguls, business executives, etc., communicate their career in this way, and that is really not my posture. My posture is to try and be as aligned as possible, to not force things, to trust not only in my skill set but also to trust in the position that I've been placed in, and look for quality over quantity. Sometimes looking for quantity over quality dictates scarcity. It suggests that we are the ones who are in control of our success, and we will try and stock up as much as we can. And that's not what life is about, number one. And number two, that's also not necessarily a sustainable way to be living. You're going to be exerting so much strength to your detriment. And this is where embracing too far in the spectrum, in this case, the masculine energy, starts to backfire on you, because you now start to get entangled in business partnerships that maybe you shouldn't have been. You start to overexert your energy. You shouldn't need to be in a position where you're constantly exerting, and it feels like this upward hill battle there where you constantly have to use all of your resources. I think about different verses in the Bible, like Proverbs 10:22, that says, the blessing of the Lord brings wealth and adds no sorrow to it, or adds no painful toil to it. This idea that there are different ways to get wealth, there are different ways to build what you're building in life, but the way of the Lord is not one that adds unnecessary strain. Whereas if you're using all your efforts and power, you start to get into a world of unnecessary strain, and irrespective of your gender, that strong focus on masculine may actually not be helpful for you at all. I also live by Galatians 3 verses 3-6 in my business because I believe it was started by God and it's going to be God who's going to finish it. It's a verse that I came across when I was in a bit of a scenario where I was wondering, how do I move forward in this? Like, why is everything so hard? And I came across it and it said, are you so foolish? After beginning by the means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by the means of the flesh? Does God give you his Spirit and work miracles among you by the works of the law, i.e. effort, i.e. masculine energy, or by your believing in what you've heard? When you believe what you've heard, you don't necessarily see it all the time, but you trust. You have a posture that is not dictated by scarcity. You have a posture that knows the value of what is coming your way, even if you can't see it, and you don't make rash decisions. And I feel like that really encapsulates like just the different dynamics, especially in the workplace I've mentioned, where masculine and feminine energy have their space to shine, have their platform. It's not about one being better than the other. It's about knowing the time and the place and the scenario and the strategy to use at a given time. That's what matters. Steaming ahead in my own willpower in general, with nothing else, with no calm and confident belief, always fails for me, always. And just like knowing your worth in work is important, it's equally important in all types of relationships. Making an effort is a key part of relationships, but there's a difference between doing that and overexerting yourself, or putting unnecessary pressure on someone else to do something for you. In this context, I don't think masculine and feminine energy is really about like your appearance. You know, there are some people that appear soft and girly, let's say, or they fit whatever standards people are saying are the beauty standard at the given time, but in their behavior in the relationship, it's very controlling, it's very manipulative, there's a lot of strategies, there's a lot of acting out. And if you find yourself pulling stunts and running secret strategies to try and compel someone to do something that they should be doing out of the overflow of their admiration, their love, their support for you, then you're probably operating in an extreme masculine zone, not just to your detriment, but to the other person's as well. And that's something to really think about, because I do think sometimes, and I understand why we get there, because it's easier to judge stuff based on what you see, but it's so easy to get carried away with what we see in terms of how we understand these concepts that we actually then just stop. And we miss the fact that so much of life is actually not about what we see. What we see is the fruits of the unseen, but we don't spend enough time talking about that. We don't spend enough time cultivating that. We don't spend enough time developing that. And that's probably where we're getting stuck. One of the biggest strengths of feminine energy in different relationships that tends to go underutilized is simply knowing your worth. When you know your worth, you know when to have boundaries and communicate your expectations. Feminine energy lets things flow and embraces its state of being. Therefore, you won't be afraid that you will lose someone if you express a simple need or communicate a boundary. We shouldn't feel afraid to say, this is what I'd love, or this is what I'd expect, and think we're gonna lose someone. Feminine energy is confident in its desires and its expectations. And if you find yourself compromising on all your values and your rules to get someone to do X, Y, Z for you, then you're probably beginning to operate in an extreme masculine, not only to your detriment, but to the other person's as well. So yeah, as I said before, making an effort is really important, and being organized enough to remember people's big moments, support them and make things happen is equally valuable. That is the getting stuff done mode. That is the masculine energy mode. If you believe that everything should just come to you with no effort and the other person should be doing all the heavy lifting, then you might be going overboard in the hyper-feminine zone, in the hyper-feminine energy zone, which ultimately is kind of neglectful, it's kind of selfish, and it embraces none of the values of community and empathy that are embodied in feminine energy anyway. So again, you start to see that there's like this balance between the two, and it's about being mindful about when to embrace a certain aspect and when to pull back. Obviously, I think it goes without saying that it's not one size fits all. You've also got to be aware of things like how you want to show up in your relationships in general. We all have a different picture. Like I said before, we all know our dispositions, we all know our strengths, etc., etc. The other thing you want to consider is what your mutually agreed roles are in that friendship, in that relationship, because that may also call for different types of contributions from different people. And then also understanding whether the other person that you're in relationship with is masculine or feminine dominant, and what that then means for the both of you. It takes some paying attention. It's not always easy to ascertain. It takes some practice, and I think that's okay. You know, we want our relationships to have longevity, so they're worth the investment. But one thing that I do definitely know is that if you feel energetically frustrated for prolonged periods of time, you feel like you're overexerting too much, or you feel like nothing's really progressing and it's just all kind of like unclear, then you need to change your approach and balance the two energies within you, or be willing to move on. And moving on is okay. In friendships, I think it definitely oscillates over time based on what someone needs and where you're at in that friendship. We all go through different phases of life, and sometimes everyone needs different things at different points. So much of this is intuitive, the feminine, the spirit, and then you take action. So much of understanding how you show up in your relationships, how you're fulfilled in your relationships, starts with the intuition, starts with the spirit, starts with the mindset. And then from there, you overflow into the masculine, the flesh, you take action off the back of it. And in a way, I think that's generally like the strategy with this whole energy thing, this masculine, feminine energy, starting with the feminine and then using the masculine to like kind of close the deal. I said this in a previous podcast episode that, you know, good things aren't conjured, they are conceived first. So like you receive, you conceive them, and then you carry them out. You don't just conjure them up on your own. And that whole idea of like conceive and then carry it out is kind of like spirit, then body, or like feminine energy, then masculine energy to execute. And I think it really clicked for me. It really made the whole principle about masculine, feminine energy make more sense beyond trying to play up to gender norms that were fabricated in the last 100 years. So I hope this is providing some clarity. I hope it's beginning to make a little bit of sense. And some of you might be wondering, like, so how do you hone your intuition? How do you discern what's really needed in a given point in time? And I think the key thing is to be able to create some space for yourself in your private time to reflect, to realign, and to receive the insights and spiritual downloads that can help you then figure out how to take action in your life. Even as I describe this, that whole process of taking a step back is, again, in the zone of feminine spirit energy, as mentioned previously. And again, if we look at the Bible, we see that Jesus, it says he constantly withdrew to like align with God. It doesn't say that he worked harder, he did more miracles, he did more public speaking to help him prepare for the next phase of his life. He started always in the spirit. After all, we are spiritual beings and we are having a human experience. So perhaps that's the order in which, when in doubt, our energy should be applied. We take that step, we take the spirit first, and then we act in the body. We take the feminine energy, the intuition, the way of being, the receiving, the creativity, and then we take action from the insights that we've gleaned from taking a step back. The biggest breakthroughs I always find have come from retreating and regrouping. They come from stewarding those new ideas and like cultivating them, incubating them before taking action. In all of these cases, it doesn't start with what you do or how you look. It's about the mindset and your approach. And I think that's where, in general discourse, we've been falling short a little bit on this conversation about masculine and feminine energy. One thing to always ask yourself as like a strong litmus test is, am I being led by my way of being, my intuition, and an underlying belief that there is no scarcity, i.e. feminine energy? Or am I trying to contort myself to a way of doing that isn't truly suited to me and is enlisted by someone else, extreme masculine? Being able to strike the balance between the two and knowing when to spring into action is everything. And I feel like that takes a lot of paying attention to yourself, your own life, and your internal state. And you'll be able to figure out which strategy to apply as the days progress, as life progresses, as your relationships progress, as work progresses, as your health progresses. You can start to observe and take notes and adjust your strategy depending on the situation that's required. So I hope this helped. A little bit of a breakdown into masculine versus feminine energy from my perspective. I'd love to know what you think on this one, because this is a topic that it's talked about a lot lately. I don't know that there's much insight in there. And when I just started to do my own reflection, I started to feel like, okay, maybe I'm getting somewhere. Maybe I understand this, at least for my own brain, the way my own brain like calculates things. I've had a bit of insight. So I was really excited to share this with you, and I just thank you so much for listening as always. Share this with somebody or people, ideally multiple people who you think would enjoy and benefit from this, and we'll speak again next week.